But like I alluded to, we're going to be starting off the show today by talking about the win for the Dallas Mavericks in their Game 3 matchup that took place last night. Since the last time we were here on this show, the Mavericks took both games, both of which coming down to the fourth quarter and the late game execution of this Mavericks team, and specifically the offense of Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving has just been absolutely tremendous for them. And it just, the Timberwolves have tried a bunch of different things in order to try and slow Luka and Kyrie down, but in these clutch situations, there really is just only so much you can do against them, and the two of them just trade turns. Luka Doncic finishes this game with 33 points, 5 assists, and 5 steals, an improved defensive game for him as well, where, listen, I think that for me personally, Luka's defense is a little bit of an enigma to figure out, because it does seem somewhat reminiscent of the James Harden defense, where a lot of the time he does seem checked out defensively, but when he is locked in, he can make big plays. He has even a little bit more size than James Harden, and I don't mean that that comparison in a negative way. I know that James Harden is known for not being a great defender, but it's about the effort for him. And for Luka, I think especially as he's dealing with all of these different injuries, I understand why he is a little bit less consistent, but this was definitely a positive game for him on that defensive end. Like I mentioned, just sort of getting his hands in on a variety of different plays, helping to lead to the 5 steals. And it was him alongside Kyrie Irving, where the two of them were just down the stretch of this game taking turns, and it's almost the best possible version of where it seems like you look at a team like the Phoenix Suns, who have a lot of individual scorers, and it seems like when they take turns, it's sort of disjointed, the flow of the offense as a whole, but something about this combination of Luka and Kyrie is just so incredible to see them working in tandem, sort of pulling out different pieces of this very excellent Minnesota defense, and it just hasn't been too much for the Timberwolves to really get a feel of. And Stan Van Gundy talks about it all the time on the broadcast, this idea of trying to double team these players, and absolutely you want to force the ball out of their hands, but there was one possession in the fourth quarter that I thought was really significant, where we did see the Timberwolves send a double to get the ball out of Luka's hands. The Mavericks were sort of passing it around, and you saw that shot clock winding down. It's like, great, this is exactly where they want to be, and then Kyrie has the ball in the right corner, and he ends up driving and hitting a crazy shot. I believe it was with his left hand as the shot clock was expiring, and that's just the reality is, these guys are so good at individual scoring. There's not an easy solution for it. And for Minnesota, it's interesting because, like I mentioned, this is one of the best defenses we've seen in the past decade, and yet it doesn't really seem like they have the perfect type of defender to guard Luka Doncic as he continues on this stretch, where Jaden McDaniels was second-team All-NBA this season, and yet I don't know what it is about him. Something about, I don't know if it's the physicality or what, but Luka can just sort of get to his spots on Jaden McDaniels one-on-one. And to be fair, I think that there are, only a handful of players in the NBA that can make things really difficult for Luka. But it seemed like this Timberwolves team was going to be able to sort of pose some type of a size mismatch, and especially considering the fact that we saw Derek Lively go down with a neck injury in the second quarter, that he was ruled out for the remainder of the game, and we don't necessarily know. Sounds like a lot of it's still up in the air with him regarding whether or not he'll be available for Game 4, but the fact that they do have more size than Dallas, and it just has not played into anything yet. And you saw Minnesota down the stretch of this game playing with the different lineups to try and slow down this duo, where Rudy Gobert was sitting on the bench for a lot of the game. a lot of that fourth quarter, I should say, they were running minutes as well with it was Karl Anthony Towns and Naz Reid, and then Cat ends up checking out for Gobert, and then eventually they switch again to trying to overwhelm them with size, but it just wasn't enough. And, Gobert has caught a ton of slack throughout this series. The reality is, especially when you have the Luka game winner, if you didn't see game 2, it was Luka in isolation with Rudy Gobert. He ends up hitting the 3 over him. That, a lot of people obviously have strong feelings on Rudy Gobert. Our host of the basketball podcast, Nelson Jimenez, earlier today, he talked about his dislike for Rudy Gobert, talked about how he started COVID. I don't know if I would go that far necessarily, but, Gobert has been somebody who's been extremely polarizing. I mean, just ask Draymond Green, who has taken, this personal agenda of trying to sort of slander Rudy Gobert while he's on the TNT set through this final series. But, I think that ultimately, like I mentioned, there just isn't really an answer for either Kyrie or Luka. Now, this has been a very disappointing series for Minnesota as a whole. Anthony Edwards, Karl Anthony Towns just have not been good enough. And Anthony Edwards was better in this game, at least. He had 26 points, 11 of 24 from the field. He started to sort of ignite what seemed like it was going to be the Timberwolves pulling off this big run in the third quarter where he scored 12 points. He dunked all over Daniel Gafford, but Gafford ended up being super impactful down the stretch as well with the two-way effort. And again, the fact that the size and the big man conversation was supposed to go in favor of the Timberwolves, and now we're seeing Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford sort of winning those matchups, absolutely has to feel like a letdown for the Minnesota Timberwolves. But, ultimately, I do think this comes down to a little bit of the execution of stars. Karl Anthony Towns has really struggled throughout this series, and, he had the quotes post-game where said can't help but laugh a little bit. He's putting up, said something along the lines of, 1,500 shots a day or something like that. We understand that, Karl Anthony Towns is one of the most talented bigs in the league, but there have always been questions with him, and especially when you see him in these games trying to sort of drive and attack closeouts when the three-point shot isn't falling for him. He's shooting just under 14% on 7 attempts per game, so that's been horrendous for them. And then when he's trying to attack these drives, he's really struggling there as well. So only shooting 28% from the field in general. He just has to be better. And as for Anthony Edwards, the Timberwolves tried to make some adjustments coming into this game where Anthony Edwards was guarding Kyrie Irving for the first couple of games. They saw how much of a physical toll it was taking on Ant trying to be the primary defender on somebody like Kyrie, so they end up putting Mike Conley on him. Conley gets into foul trouble, which does also sort of help hurt the fluidity of the Timberwolves offense. And, ultimately, I think that when you look at this big picture, it's just a conversation about who are the players that are postseason ready and are the best closers in the game, because more times than not, you're going to get close matchups. I feel like the NBA playoffs, by the way, on a quick aside, has been so much better in terms of, actually having some of these competitive games this year, where it seems like in years past we've had just tons of blowouts sort of stacking up, but we're getting a lot more competitive games, at least in my eyes, this time around, and that goes in favor of the Dallas Mavericks, where this duo of Luka and Kyrie is just incredible, and there's a reason why they were the number one offensive rating team in clutch situations during the regular season, and 32 clutch situations. They had a 127.1 offensive rating. Meanwhile, the Timberwolves were in the bottom third of the league, where they were 22nd. And we've seen their numbers actually in terms of that specific offensive rating number. We have seen that go up for the Timberwolves in the postseason because they did a really good job in some of those Nuggets games. But at the same time, you're going up against the Mavericks, and they are sort of the clutch kings, and you have Luka and Kyrie that are this sort of a, dominant 1-2 combo in terms of scoring, that it's just been really tough for Minnesota. And you know what? The reality is they're still a young team, and they are going to be back in the near future. That being said, I am curious whether or not we're going to see this exact same iteration. Anthony Edwards is going to be eligible for the Supermax this offseason after making an All-NBA team this year. What they choose to do with Karl Anthony Towns, I do think, is the biggest question around that. But their season isn't over just yet, so I want to sort of hold off those conversations for now. But let me know what your thoughts were on this game and this series moving forward as the Mavericks hold a 3-0 series lead. But we are going to be taking our first break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to discuss Luka Doncic and the run that he is currently on, and whether or not a championship would put him at the top of the league in terms of who is the best player in the NBA in that conversation. So again, going to be taking our quick break here. Quick shout out to the Golden Eagle 99 in the comment section. Again, if you are a live viewer, be sure to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings. But we're going to be taking our break here, and we will be right back after this quick break.